Before the Second World War rewrote the map of the world, one man sat at a desk in a peacetime army and wrote down exactly how it would happen. Not in broad strokes, not in vague strategic theory, in precise technical operational detail, the number of tanks, the width of the advance, the radio frequencies, the fuel requirements, the exact speed at which a modern army could be made to collapse before it even understood what was hitting it. His name was Heinz Guderian. He was a colonel with chalk dust on his uniform, and an argument that almost nobody in power wanted to hear. Within 3 years of publishing that argument in print, his armoured columns had crossed the Ardennes forest, shattered the French army in 6 weeks, and driven to the English Channel with a speed that left the entire world struggling to explain what it had just witnessed. His career spans the complete arc of the Second World War, from the first theoretical sparks of the 1920s through the lightning conquests of 1939 and 1940, into the vast catastrophe of the Eastern Front, and finally into the burning ruins of a Berlin that was collapsing around a man who no longer listened to anyone. Guderian argued with Hitler, repeatedly, at personal risk, about tanks, about strategy, about the difference between what an army could actually do and what political will demanded it pretend it could do. He was dismissed twice. He was recalled twice. He was given the most senior staff position in the German army the day after an assassination attempt, and he spent the remaining 8 months of the war making arguments in a command structure that had already decided it preferred mythology over military reality. But this is not a story about a misunderstood genius. It is something more difficult than that, and more important, because the same man who built the most revolutionary armoured doctrine of the 20th century also served, without documented objection, a war that had mass murder written into its operational framework from the beginning. The same officer who kept pressing honest assessments into a system that punished honesty also wrote a memoir after the war that left the most consequential truths out. Guderian's story is the story of what happens when exceptional professional talent and profound moral failure live in the same person, wear the same uniform, and get recorded in the same archives. This is that story in full and without shortcuts. If you're new to this channel, welcome. If you've been here before, you know how I do this. We go slow where the detail matters. We go fast where we need to feel the pace. We don't invent quotes. We don't dress up uncertainty as fact. And we never reduce complicated human beings to cardboard. Hit subscribe. There are more of these coming. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Making of a Soldier, Culm, the Jaegers, and a War That Taught Him Nothing. He wanted to learn. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was born on the 17th of June, 1888, in the town of Culm, a place that today sits inside Poland on the Vistula River and goes by the name Chemno. It was then a garrison town in the Prussian province of West Prussia, the kind of place where the streets smelled of horses and boot polish, and you could hear the sound of military drill at 6 in the morning if the windows were open. His father, Friedrich Guderian, was an army officer. His grandfather had been an army officer. The military wasn't a career choice for Heinz Guderian. It was the water he was born swimming in. I've looked at a few brief biographical notes on Guderian's early life, and what strikes me most is how unremarkable the beginning actually was by the standards of his eventual career. He enrolled in military school as a boy, the cadet institutes at Karls and Berlin-Lichterfelde, which were essentially the standard pipeline for sons of the Prussian officer class. These weren't places that prized creativity. They prized discipline, hierarchy, and the memorization of doctrine. That Guderian eventually produced some of the most original military thinking in European history, while coming out of that system tells you something about the particular stubbornness of the man's intellect. He was commissioned in 1908 joining the Hanover Jägers, a light infantry regiment, not cavalry, not artillery, infantry with a specialization in communications. That communications background matters enormously, and I'll come back to it several times in this documentary, because it's one of the things that separated Guderian from other armored warfare advocates. He wasn't just thinking about where tanks should go. He was thinking about how commanders in moving tanks could talk to each other in real time. That was the actual revolution. The hardware was almost secondary. Before the First World War even began, Guderian had qualified as a signals officer and was deeply embedded in the question of how information moved across a battlefield. In an era when most infantry officers thought about war in terms of men, rifles, and fixed defensive lines, Guderian was thinking about the speed of communication. He was, in a sense, already preparing for a war that hadn't been invented yet. The war he was about to enter, the First World War, the Western Front, mud and wire, and the unimaginable grinding immobility of trench warfare, was the exact opposite of everything he was building toward. Guderian served in the First World War primarily as a staff officer. He didn't command large frontline formations during those years, in the way that some of his contemporaries did. He observed, he processed, he administered. And what he absorbed during those years wasn't the romance of the charge or the heroism of holding a line. What he absorbed was the horror of stalemate. What he took from the Western Front was essentially a negative lesson, a detailed, empirically grounded understanding of what happens when armies run out of speed. When you can't move, you die by the thousands for a field. He filed that away. After the armistice in 1918, Germany's military establishment was shattered, reorganized, and radically reduced under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The army was limited to 100,000 men. Heavy weapons were restricted. Tanks were banned. For most officers, this was the end of any serious military ambition. For Guderian, it was the beginning of a period of intense theoretical work that would, over the next 2 decades, reshape how modern armies fought. He stayed in the army. He began to read. What he read and where he read it matters. Guderian was deeply influenced by British military theorists, specifically Basil Liddell Hart and John Frederick Charles Fuller. Fuller had written extensively about the tank's potential after witnessing the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, where British armoured vehicles had briefly broken through German lines and demonstrated, however fleetingly, what concentrated armour could do. Liddell Hart's work on the indirect approach to warfare, hitting an enemy at their weakest point rather than their strongest, using speed and surprise rather than mass and attrition, resonated profoundly with Guderian's own thinking about the catastrophic failures of the Western Front. He was reading British officers to think about how to beat the British. That's a particular kind of irony that military history is very good at producing. In 1922, Guderian was assigned to the Inspectorate of Motorized Troops, a new organizational unit tasked with exploring the military potential of automobiles and armored vehicles. This was not, at the time, a prestigious appointment. The old guard of the German military looked at motor vehicles with the same mild contempt that cavalry officers had once directed at the early horseless carriage. Tanks were seen as expensive, unreliable, and ultimately subordinate to the proper business of infantry. Guderian was given this posting partly because of his communications background, partly because someone had to do it. He threw himself into it with the focus of a man who believed, absolutely, that he was looking at the future. Through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, Guderian worked in the motorized troops inspectorate, teaching, writing, and conducting mock exercises, sometimes with actual trucks playing the role of tanks because the army couldn't possess real ones under Versailles restrictions. These exercises weren't theatre. They were laboratories. Guderian and his colleagues were working out in real terrain with real officers, making real decisions under simulated pressure. Whether the doctrines he was developing actually held up, the radio communications question kept coming back. A tank without radio was a single weapon. A platoon of tanks with radio was a coordinated system. 20 tanks with radio communication moving together, with infantry and air support coordinated in real time. That was something different entirely. That was what he was trying to build. By 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power and began to systematically dismantle the Versailles restrictions, Guderian was in his mid-40s, a colonel with a very clear idea of what the new German army should look like, and a great deal of accumulated frustration at how slowly the institution had been willing to hear him. The political change opened a door. Guderian walked through it. And what followed? The rapid expansion of the Panzer force, the construction of genuine armored divisions rather than infantry divisions with tank attachments, was the translation of 15 years of theoretical work into steel and rubber and exhaust. The theorist was about to become a practitioner. He didn't waste the opportunity. Chapter 2. Achtung Panzer. The book that changed war before the war started. There's something almost absurdly straightforward about the title of Guderian's 1937 book. Achtung Panzer. Attention, tank. Or, more idiomatically in German, beware of the tank. It doesn't dress itself up. It doesn't claim to be grand theory. And yet, sitting with the content of that book, which I've read in its English translation, a paperback that I've underlined so heavily it's barely readable now, what you find is one of the most prescient documents in the entire history of armored warfare. It described a way of fighting that Germany would put into practice 2 years later in Poland and then again in France, and the armies facing those German formations would discover at catastrophic cost that they had not read it. The central argument of Achtung, Panzer, is deceptively simple. Tanks must be used in mass, concentrated formations, at the point of an enemy's greatest weakness, in close coordination with motorized infantry and air support, moving faster than the enemy's command structure can respond. That last element is the crucial one, and it's the element most often left out of simplistic accounts of Blitzkrieg. It wasn't just about tanks being fast. It was about the information gap. The gap between the speed at which a panzer column could move and the speed at which an opponent's headquarters could process what was happening, formulate a response, issue orders, and get those orders executed. If you move faster than that cycle, the enemy is always reacting to where you were, not where you are. Guderian drew heavily on Fuller and Liddell Hart, which he acknowledged openly in the text. He also drew on the French work of Charles de Gaulle, whose own arguments for concentrated armoured formations had been largely ignored by the French military establishment. There is a particular melancholy in that detail, which I always find myself pausing on. De Gaulle was arguing in France for exactly the doctrine that would destroy the French army in 1940. The French didn't listen to de Gaulle. The Germans, reading the same theoretical literature, did. History doesn't get much more pointed than that. What made Guderian's book different from the theoretical work of Fuller and Liddell Hart was that Guderian was writing from inside a military organization that was actually building the force he was describing. By 1937, Germany had real panzer divisions, not exercises with trucks playing tanks, but actual armored formations with genuine vehicles, trained crews, and radio communications networks. The book wasn't purely speculative. It was already partly descriptive. Guderian was in the middle of a feedback loop between theory and practice that the British and French theorists, however brilliant, simply didn't have access to. The book was also, in important ways, a political document within the German military. There were powerful figures in the Wehrmacht who opposed Guderian's doctrinal vision. Senior infantry officers who believed tanks should be distributed across the front in small packets to support foot soldiers, not massed into independent armoured spearheads. Chief of the General Staff Franz Halder was sceptical. Many division commanders thought Guderian was a visionary in the worst sense, a man in love with his own idea. Achtung, Panzer was, among other things, Guderian's attempt to win that internal argument through public print. It was a book written for the German public and the international military press, but it was aimed, with considerable precision, at the German High Command. He also, crucially, attracted the attention of Hitler. In 1935, Guderian had demonstrated his armoured vehicles to the Führer, and Hitler's famous response, "That's what I need, that's what I want to have," is one of the most consequential moments of enthusiasm in modern military history. Here was a head of state who grasped intuitively, if not technically, what concentrated armour could mean. Hitler had been a corporal in the trenches. He understood viscerally the horror of immobile attritional warfare. When Guderian showed him machines that could end that kind of warfare, Hitler was converted instantly, and that conversion gave Guderian something that Fuller and Liddell Hart never had: a head of government willing to fund, equip, and politically defend the doctrine. I want to be careful here not to suggest that the relationship between Guderian and Hitler was simply one of a talented officer finding a useful patron. It was more complicated than that, and we'll spend considerable time in later chapters examining those complications. But in the mid to late 1930s, the relationship worked. Hitler wanted a mobile, aggressive army. Guderian had the theory and the energy to build one. The bureaucratic obstacles that might have buried another officer's career were repeatedly swept away because the Führer was watching, and the Führer approved. Guderian was promoted to general officer rank, given command of the 2nd Panzer Division, and then elevated to chief of mobile troops in November 1938. He was building an army inside the army. By the time Achtung, Panzer was published, Germany had 3 panzer divisions. Guderian wanted more, wanted them better equipped, wanted their commanders trained to think in terms of deep penetration rather than linear advance. The organizational battles he fought during these years against quartermaster generals who couldn't grasp why tanks needed fuel and spare parts at a pace the old logistics system wasn't designed for, against training establishments that were still teaching World War I methods, were as important as anything he later did in the field. You can have the most brilliant doctrine in the world. If the logistics don't work and the crews can't execute it, the doctrine is just words. What I find genuinely admirable about Guderian's intellectual project in this period, whatever else one might say about him, is the rigor of it. This wasn't impressionism. He ran exercises, analysed results, revised doctrine, reran exercises. He corresponded with British and French theorists. He studied the technical limitations of his own vehicles with obsessive attention. The range of a tank before it needed to refuel was not an abstraction to him. It was a tactical constraint that shaped every operational plan. The gap between an intellectual who theorizes about war and a practitioner who has to make war happen with imperfect tools in mud and rain. Guderian bridged that gap more successfully than almost any officer of his generation. When war came in September 1939, Guderian was 51 years old, a lieutenant general commanding the 19th Panzer Corps. He had spent roughly 2 decades preparing for this moment. The question was whether the theory would hold when it met the actual enemy. It did, but it held in ways that even Guderian hadn't entirely expected, and the speed of what unfolded in Poland would reshape the expectations of every army in Europe, including, fatally, the expectations of Guderian himself about what armoured warfare could and could not sustain. Chapter 3. Poland, September 1939. The proof of concept, the invasion of Poland, began in the early hours of the 1st of September 1939, and it ended, for practical purposes, in less than 4 weeks. I've sat with a lot of campaign narratives in my time, and the Polish campaign is one of the ones I find historians still arguing about, not about the outcome, which was never really in question given the disparity in forces and the simultaneous Soviet invasion from the east, but about what the campaign actually proved. Was it a validation of Guderian's armoured doctrine? Yes, in important ways. Was it also a misleading validation? A campaign whose decisive outcome owed as much to geography, numerical advantage, and the absence of serious mechanized opposition as to any theoretical breakthrough? Also yes. Guderian commanded the 19th Panzer Corps, which formed part of General Fedor von Bock's Army Group North. The corps included the 3rd Panzer Division, the 2nd and 20th Motorized Infantry Divisions, and various attached units. What Guderian was doing with this formation was, in structural terms, exactly what Achtung, Panzer, had described. Concentrated armor at the point of breakthrough, motorized infantry to follow up and consolidate, rapid exploitation of the gap rather than pausing to allow the enemy to reconstitute their line. The Polish army was not unimpressive. This is something I want to be clear about because the popular image of the Polish campaign, of cavalry charging tanks, of a hopelessly outdated army simply rolled over, is substantially false. Poland had a professional officer corps, genuine defensive doctrine, and real fighting spirit, but they were defending a long border on multiple fronts against 2 adversaries simultaneously after the Soviet invasion began on the 17th of September, with insufficient motorized transport and a doctrine that was still oriented toward the kind of linear defense that Guderian's corps was specifically designed to rupture. The mismatch wasn't stupidity on the Polish side, it was structural. What the campaign demonstrated, in practical terms, was that the radio communications network Guderian had spent years building actually worked under combat conditions. This was not a foregone conclusion. Radios in 1939 were bulky, temperamental, and prone to interference. Operating them from inside a moving tank, under fire, while trying to coordinate with adjacent units, that was genuinely difficult. The fact that Guderian's corps maintained coherent coordination at operational tempo, that his tank commanders could receive and transmit position updates in near real time, was itself a significant achievement. It was also invisible to observers, who only looked at the tanks themselves. I'm drawn to one particular aspect of the Polish campaign that doesn't get enough attention in general histories. The logistics. Guderian's corps advanced at speeds that outran not just the enemy, but his own supply lines. Fuel was a constant anxiety. The maintenance and repair capacity of his formations was strained almost immediately. By the 2nd week of operations, the Panzer divisions were running a percentage of their vehicles at reduced capability due to mechanical wear and shortage of spare parts. This was in a 4-week campaign. The implications for a much longer, much deeper campaign were already visible to anyone willing to look. Guderian looked. He filed reports. He raised concerns through proper channels. He understood, with the engineer's mind he had developed over 20 years of studying armoured warfare, that the logistics chain was the limiting factor, not the fighting quality of his crews, or the theoretical soundness of his doctrine. The German army's logistical planning was good by the standards of 1939. It was not good enough for the kind of war Guderian was winning. He knew it. He said it. Nobody with sufficient authority to act on it paid adequate attention. That gap between what the Panzer Force could do for 2 or 3 weeks and what it could sustain for months would eventually become catastrophic. The campaign ended with a German victory that was, by any measure, operationally decisive. The Polish state effectively ceased to exist by the end of the month. Guderian had personally been at the front, often in his command vehicle well forward of where a corps commander was conventionally expected to be. This was deliberate. Part of his tactical philosophy, which held that commanders needed to see the battlefield directly, rather than operating from fixed headquarters, on the basis of reports that were always at least several hours old. It was a style of command that worked extraordinarily well in fast-moving operations. It also meant that Guderian sometimes made decisions based on what he could see from his vehicle, which wasn't always the whole picture. The question after Poland was what came next. Guderian and the High Command now turned west, and the planning for what would become the fall of France, the most dramatic, in some ways the most intellectually extraordinary campaign of the entire Second World War, began in earnest during the winter of 1939 to 1940. Guderian opposed the original German plan for the Western offensive. That plan, the initial version known to historians, essentially proposed a modified version of the old Schlieffen approach, a sweep through Belgium and the Netherlands. Guderian thought it was too predictable, too slow, and too easily countered. He wasn't the only one who thought so, but he was among the most vocal. What happened next? The revision of the plan into what became Vollgelb, with the main armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, is one of the pivotal episodes in the entire history of armoured warfare. I've spent a lot of time with the historiography of that planning process, and I'm still not entirely satisfied that we know, with precision, who deserves credit for the Ardennes concept as finally executed. Erich von Manstein is traditionally credited with the core idea. Guderian's crucial contribution was insisting, and demonstrating with planning analysis, that it was actually mechanically and logistically possible to push a large armoured force through the Ardennes in sufficient time to achieve surprise. That was not obvious. The Ardennes were considered, by the French military, to be essentially impassable for armour. Guderian's knowledge of his own vehicles told him otherwise. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. If the French had detected the armoured concentration in the Ardennes, if they had managed to deploy artillery and reserves to the Meuse crossings before Guderian could force them, the entire offensive might have collapsed. That this didn't happen was partly German speed, partly surprise, and partly a catastrophic failure of French intelligence and command response time. All three of those factors were real. You can argue about their relative weight. What you can't argue is the result. Guderian was 51 years old. He had waited 20 years for this moment. He had written the book, trained the soldiers, fought the bureaucratic battles, survived the skeptics. In May of 1940, the exam was about to begin. He had no way of knowing, standing on the German side of the Luxembourg border in the first days of May, that the campaign ahead would be over in weeks and would establish his reputation for the rest of his life. He had no way of knowing either that it would teach him lessons he hadn't learned in Poland, lessons about the limits of his own authority, about the relationship between military genius and political power, about what happens when the man at the top of the chain of command doesn't understand the doctrine you've been building for 2 decades. Chapter 4. The Ardennes and the Race to the Channel. France, May 1940. The 10th of May 1940. German forces crossed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg simultaneously. The Allied armies began to move north into Belgium, exactly as the German plan required them to. And in the Ardennes forest, a column of armoured vehicles, roughly 100 kilometres long, tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, artillery tractors, began crawling through narrow forest roads in the dark. The French had decided this route was impassable for armour. They had one cavalry screening force covering the approach. One, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, was at the tip of the armoured column pushing through the Ardennes toward the Meuse River at Sedan. He had 3 Panzer divisions under his command, the 1st, 2nd, and 10th. Between them, his corps represented a concentration of armoured and motorised striking power that the French simply hadn't positioned themselves to counter at that particular point. The logic of the plan was exquisite in its simplicity. Draw the Allied attention north into Belgium with Army Group B. Then, once they've committed their reserves, drive the armoured mass through the supposedly impassable centre, reach the Meuse, cross it before reinforcements can arrive, and race to the Channel, cut the Allied army in 2. The crossing of the Meuse at Sedan began on the 13th and 14th of May. The French defensive position on the far bank was manned by reserve divisions, not front-line troops, not the best equipped formations. German air support struck the French artillery and defensive positions continuously through the crossing phase. By the evening of the 14th, Guderian's corps had bridgeheads on the western bank. The crossing had succeeded. What happened next is where the plan and its execution began to diverge in ways that nearly derailed the entire campaign. Guderian wanted to move immediately, at maximum speed, westward toward the Channel. His orders authorized a limited follow-up, consolidating the bridgehead, waiting for infantry support. He didn't wait. He pushed west. This decision, to advance beyond his authorized bounds, brought him into immediate and violent conflict with his immediate superior, General Ewald von Kleist. On the 17th of May, after several days of unauthorized advance, Kleist halted the advance and, in a heated confrontation that Guderian described in his post-war memoirs, relieved him of command, sacked him on the spot. I find this episode endlessly interesting because it crystallizes the central tension in Guderian's entire career. He was right, tactically. The French were collapsing. Every hour of delay gave the Allied command time to reconstitute a blocking position that might have stopped the armoured thrust. Speed was the weapon, and he knew it better than anyone else on that front. He was also insubordinate. He had exceeded his orders. The chain of command exists for reasons that aren't purely bureaucratic. It exists because individual commanders, however brilliant, have incomplete information. And the coordinated action of an army requires that someone coordinates it. Guderian's confidence in his own judgment was not unfounded. It was also not total. The standoff was resolved by General Siegmund List, who intervened at the army group level. Guderian was reinstated. The advance resumed. Over the following days, his corps drove west at a pace that consistently outran French attempts to establish defensive lines. By the 21st of May, German forces had reached Abbeville on the English Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium, British, French, Belgian, were effectively encircled. What had been, 10 days earlier, the most powerful concentration of Allied forces in the West, was now cut off from the main body of France. The subsequent decision to halt the Panzer advance before Dunkirk, which allowed the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate across the Channel, has been debated by military historians ever since. Guderian argued, in his memoirs and in various post-war accounts, that this halt was a catastrophic error, that had the Panzers been allowed to continue, the BEF could not have escaped, and Britain's ability to continue the war would have been fatally compromised. The historical debate is complicated by questions of whose order the halt was, whether Hitler's intervention was decisive, and what state Guderian's own vehicles were in after 10 days of continuous hard fighting. His corps wasn't at full strength. Whether it could have sealed Dunkirk is genuinely uncertain. What I've come to believe, after sitting with the historiography for a while, is that the Dunkirk halt was probably the result of multiple overlapping anxieties about exposed flanks, about overextended logistics, about the condition of the armoured force. rather than any single decision. Guderian's frustration was real. His vehicles needed maintenance. His men needed sleep. The Panzer divisions that had crossed the Ardennes 10 days earlier were running on adrenaline and improvised logistics, that they had gotten as far as the Channel was already, by any reasonable measure, astonishing. France fell on the 22nd of June, 1940. Guderian was promoted to General de Panzertruppe, following the campaign. The promotion was recognition not just of the operational success, but of the validation of an entire doctrinal project. The man who had spent 20 years arguing that concentrated armour could shatter a modern army in weeks had just shattered the French army in 6 weeks. By any measure, it was confirmation. But confirmation is a dangerous thing. It can be the beginning of wisdom, or it can be the beginning of overconfidence. In Guderian's case, in the summer of 1940, it was impossible to tell which it would be. What the France campaign had actually tested was Guderian's doctrine against a specific enemy, France, in specific circumstances, with specific dispositions and specific failures of command response. It had not tested the doctrine against an opponent with genuinely deep strategic depth, unlimited manpower reserves, and the geographic space to absorb the kind of penetration that had been fatal to France. That opponent was already being planned for. And the planning would reveal, within 18 months, every limitation that the brilliant, victorious summer of 1940 had temporarily obscured. Chapter 5, Operation Barbarossa, the largest army in history, and the day everything changed, the 22nd of June, 1941. 03:15 hours. Along a front stretching more than 1,400 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the German army crossed into Soviet territory with the largest land invasion force ever assembled, more than 3 million German soldiers, roughly 3,000 tanks, nearly 2,700 aircraft. Guderian commanded the 2nd Panzer Group, an army-level formation of roughly 250,000 men and 900 tanks, positioned in the center of the line, Army Group Center. I want to spend a moment on the scale of what I'm describing here, because I think it's very easy to process these numbers and move on without actually feeling the weight of them. 250,000 men, 900 tanks, all of them moving at once across the river Bug into a country that stretched east essentially without limit. The logistical challenge of this operation was staggering in ways that the German planning had not adequately addressed. The Soviet road network was poor by Western European standards. The railway gauge was different. German locomotives and rolling stock couldn't run on Soviet track without modification. The distances involved were categorically different from anything Guderian had operated in during the Polish or French campaigns. Poland had been a 4-week campaign covering roughly 300 kilometers of advance. The distance from the Soviet western border to Moscow alone was roughly 1,000 kilometers. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group crossed the Bug River on the first day and immediately drove east at the pace he had established as standard in Poland and France. Maximum speed. Don't stop to consolidate. Keep the enemy's command structure behind the tempo of your advance. In the first weeks, this worked with terrifying effectiveness. Together with General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group to the north, Guderian's forces closed the Minsk pocket, a vast encirclement operation that destroyed Soviet forces in western Belorussia and captured more than 300,000 prisoners. The speed was almost incomprehensible. In 3 weeks, Guderian's group had advanced roughly 600 kilometers. But even in those first successful weeks, the problems were accumulating. The dune roads of Belorussia, baked hard in summer heat, turned tanks into dust-coated mechanical devices that needed constant maintenance. By mid-summer, Guderian's Panzer Group had sustained alarming losses of vehicles, not primarily from enemy action in the early weeks, but from mechanical wear. The Soviet T-34 tank, encountered in increasing numbers from late June and July onward, came as a genuine shock. Guderian himself, in an extraordinary move for a senior officer, proposed at a meeting with senior German tank designers and manufacturers in November that the fastest solution to the T-34 problem would be to produce a direct copy of the Soviet design. His own superiors rejected the proposal. It reveals something important about his state of mind by that point. He was a man looking at his own army's equipment and seeing inadequacy. The strategic argument that erupted after the Battle of Smolensk in late July and early August 1941 is one of the most consequential disputes in the entire history of the war. After the encirclement and destruction of Soviet armies around Smolensk, the question was, where next? The Army High Command, including Franz Halder and most of the operational planners, argued for a continued drive on Moscow. Moscow was the Soviet capital, the hub of the railway network, the center of industrial and political control. Take Moscow, the argument went, and the Soviet state might collapse. Guderian had initially agreed with this logic. Hitler wanted to turn south into Ukraine, toward the industrial resources of the Donbass and the agricultural wealth of the country's heartland. The debate was fierce, and the final decision was Hitler's: south to Kiev. Here is where the historiography gets genuinely murky, and I want to be precise about what I know and what I don't. At a meeting at Führer's headquarters, Guderian, who had been one of the voices arguing for the Moscow drive, unexpectedly sided with Hitler's preference for the southern operation. His reasons, given later in his memoirs, involve his assessment of the situation on the ground and the condition of his forces. But the reversal shocked and angered Halder and Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, and it permanently damaged Guderian's relationships with significant elements of the German High Command. Whether Guderian genuinely changed his assessment, or whether he made a political calculation to side with the Führer, is something I honestly can't determine from the available sources. Both explanations are consistent with what we know of his character. The Kiev encirclement operation, conducted in September, was, in purely operational terms, the largest encirclement battle in the history of warfare. Soviet losses in the Kiev pocket exceeded 600,000 men. German forces, including Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, had executed a pincer movement of extraordinary geographical scale, driving south from Army Group Center, while Army Group South drove north. By any measure of military execution, it was a stunning achievement. Guderian had been essential to it. He had driven his men and machines through summer heat and autumn mud to close a trap that the Soviet command couldn't escape. But by the time the Kiev pocket was sealed, the German forces were exhausted and badly worn. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group had 21% of its tanks in operational condition. Read that again, 21%. Out of every 100 tanks that had crossed the Bug River on the 22nd of June, roughly 20 were still functioning as of mid-September. The rest were knocked out, broken down, or awaiting repair. This was the force that was now supposed to turn north, resume the advance on Moscow, and take the Soviet capital before winter. This was the force that was supposed to deliver the decisive blow of the entire Eastern campaign. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, began on the 30th of September for Guderian's group. In October, there were further encirclements, further prisoner hauls, continued Soviet disarray. And then, in late October and early November, something changed. The autumn rains turned the roads to mud. Not inconvenient mud. Mud of a depth and consistency that swallowed wheeled vehicles to their axles and reduced tank columns to slow grinding lines of machinery burning fuel at 5 times the normal rate. Then the mud froze, and the temperature dropped, and the German army, which had not been equipped for winter operations, because the planning assumption was that the Soviet Union would be defeated before winter. Discovered that 18 degrees below zero is not the same as a mild Western European autumn. Guderian's forces ground forward painfully through November. By the end of the month, they had reached the outskirts of Tula, roughly 125 kilometers south of Moscow. It was the closest they would get. The Red Army counterattack in early December found German formations that were, in many cases, at minimal combat strength. Vehicles that wouldn't start in the cold, men without adequate winter clothing, supply lines stretched to the point of near failure. Guderian began pulling his forces back to defensible ground. He hadn't been given permission to do this. Chapter 6. The Christmas Dismissal. When the general said no, the 25th of December, 1941. Christmas Day. Heinz Guderian, commanding a Panzer army that had just failed to take Moscow, who was watching the Soviet counteroffensive push his exhausted, frostbitten formations back through the same ground they had fought over in autumn, received word that he was relieved of his command, dismissed by Hitler on Christmas Day. He was 53 years old. He had just come off the most demanding 6 months of his military career, and now he was finished. I've thought about this moment a lot. Not with sympathy. The war Guderian was fighting in the East was not a clean professional conflict, and we'll have to address that honestly in later chapters, but with a kind of historical fascination at the particular shape of the fall, because this wasn't just a commander being relieved for a military failure. It was more complicated than that. It was the first major rupture in the relationship between Guderian and Hitler, a relationship that had, for 6 years, been mutually useful. And the rupture revealed something important about both men. The immediate cause of the dismissal was Guderian's decision to withdraw his forces against orders. Hitler had issued a general stand-fast directive: no withdrawals, hold current positions, regardless of the tactical situation. This order reflected Hitler's theory, formed partly from his reading of German operations in the First World War, that ordered withdrawals under pressure had a tendency to become panics, that maintaining defensive lines by will and discipline could hold what otherwise would crumble. There was a logic to it. There was also a professional military counter-argument of considerable force, that holding tactically indefensible positions simply allowed them to be encircled and destroyed, which was worse than a managed withdrawal. Guderian had made the managed withdrawal. He had assessed the tactical situation, the state of his formations, the temperature, the Soviet pressure, and decided that holding current positions was not an executable order. He had pulled back. He had also, in doing so, fallen out with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had taken command of Army Group Center and who supported the Stand-Fast order. The relationship between Guderian and Kluge had been toxic for some time. Kluge was the more politically cautious officer. Guderian was the more operationally driven one. They did not get along. They had not gotten along for months. The tactical dispute over the withdrawal gave Kluge the pretext to push for Guderian's removal, and Hitler, already furious about the failure before Moscow, agreed. What followed the dismissal was genuinely strange, in the way that bureaucratic processes in wartime can be. Guderian was not arrested. He was not court-martialed. He was sent home to a kind of enforced leave, living in relative comfort, while the war he had helped to start continued without him. The contrast between his situation and that of his soldiers, still fighting in the eastern winter with inadequate equipment, is one of the uncomfortable textures of his biography that the memoirs he later wrote tended not to dwell on. He had been dismissed. He had not suffered. During these months of enforced leave, roughly 15 months, from Christmas 1941 to March 1943, Guderian occupied himself with writing, correspondence, and the particular frustration of a man of strong operational opinions watching events unfold from a distance. The Germans had been defeated at El Alamein in November 1942. Stalingrad was developing into a catastrophe of the first order through the winter of 1942 to 43. The strategic situation that had looked, in June 1941, like it might produce a rapid decisive victory in the East, was now clearly something else entirely. A grinding, multi-year attritional war that Germany was not equipped to win. Guderian knew this. He had, in some form, known it since the autumn of 1941. The recall came in February 1943. Guderian was summoned to meet Hitler and offered a new position: Inspector General of Armored Troops, a newly created role with responsibility for the organization, training, and equipment priorities of the German Panzer Force. It was not a field command, it was explicitly a staff and supervisory position, but it came with real authority to set production priorities, to approve or reject equipment programs, to standardize training across the Panzer Force. After 15 months watching the war from the outside, Guderian accepted. He had conditions. He wanted direct access to Hitler, bypassing the normal staff hierarchy. He wanted authority over all armored formations across all services, including Waffen-SS Panzer units that had previously operated on a separate organizational track. He got most of what he asked for. This tells you something about how desperate the German situation had become. In March 1943, Hitler needed Guderian enough to give him unusual terms. The man who had been dismissed on Christmas Day was now, 14 months later, being recalled on his own conditions. What I find most significant about this episode, the dismissal and the recall together as a unit, is what it reveals about the structural logic of the German High Command. The system had dismissed one of its most operationally effective commanders at a moment of maximum crisis for the specific act of exercising professional judgment against a direct order. The system then recalled that same commander when the crisis deepened, because the system lacked the capacity to fix its own problems without him. This is not a story about Guderian's genius. It's a story about institutional brittleness, about what happens when the command structure is organized around a single leader's will rather than around sound operational doctrine and honest feedback. Guderian was both a victim of that structure and, in important ways, a participant in building it. The contradiction is the point, and it will only deepen from here. Chapter 7, Inspector General, Rebuilding a Burning Machine. There's a particular cruelty in the timing of Guderian's recall. He was reinstated on the 1st of March, 1943, roughly 6 weeks after the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. The scale of what had happened at Stalingrad was, by any rational measure, a strategic catastrophe. More than 200,000 German and Axis soldiers had been encircled. The Sixth Army, one of the most capable formations in the Wehrmacht, had ceased to exist as a fighting force, and Guderian was being handed the job of rebuilding a panzer arm that had been burning through men and machines on the Eastern Front for nearly 2 years, with insufficient replacements, inadequate logistics, and a production system that was still, in the spring of 1943, failing to deliver vehicles at anything close to combat attrition rates. That was the scale of the problem. It was enormous. His new title was Inspector General of Armored Troops. And I want to spend a moment on what that actually meant in organizational terms, because it's frequently misunderstood. He wasn't a field commander. He wasn't in the operational chain of command for any specific formation or front. What he had was supervisory authority over the training, organization, equipment, and doctrine of Germany's armored forces, across all services and all theaters. In practical terms, this meant he had the power to shape how the Panzer force was educated and equipped, and he had the direct channel to Hitler that he'd negotiated as a condition of his return. He could attend conferences, present data, argue for priorities. He didn't have the authority to override Hitler's operational decisions. That distinction would matter enormously in what came next. One of the first things Guderian did was conduct an audit of the actual state of the Panzer Force. What he found wasn't reassuring. Tank production in Germany had been criminally inefficient, not in terms of the quality of individual vehicles, but in terms of the sheer organizational waste involved in producing too many different types simultaneously. The German industrial base in 1943 was trying to produce the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, the new Panther, the Tiger Rhine, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, several varieties of assault gun, and numerous specialized variants. All simultaneously, all competing for the same machine tools, the same specialized labor, the same steel allocations. Guderian understood, with the engineer's clarity he'd developed over 2 decades, that this was madness. You couldn't fight a war of attrition against Soviet production if your own production was being eaten alive by complexity. The Panther was his central concern and his central headache during this period. The Panther tank, the Panzerkampfwagen V, had been designed in response to the T-34 shock of 1941. It was a genuinely excellent design in many respects. Sloped armor, a long, high-velocity 75mm gun, good mobility. On paper, it was the answer to the T-34. In practice, in the spring of 1943, the Panther was a manufacturing disaster. Early production vehicles suffered from persistent engine fires, transmission failures, and final drive breakdowns. The target of 600 Panthers per month was never reached. In all of 1943, production averaged roughly 148 vehicles per month, a fraction of the stated requirement. Guderian knew these numbers intimately. He argued repeatedly that the Panther needed more time before it was committed to combat. He was overruled. The battle being planned for the summer of 1943, Operation Citadel, the assault on the Soviet salient around Kursk, was already consuming Guderian's waking hours, and not in a good way. The Kursk salient was a roughly 190-kilometer wide bulge in the Eastern Front, centered on the city of Kursk, where Soviet lines protruded westward into German-held territory. The German plan was straightforward in concept. Attack the salient from north and south, simultaneously cut it off at the base, encircle the Soviet forces inside. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had been advocating a version of this idea since the spring. The problem was time. Specifically, the gap between when the plan was first proposed and when Hitler finally authorized it, which gave the Soviet command an extraordinary amount of time to prepare defenses. Guderian argued against Operation Citadel, directly in person to Hitler. His argument was this: the Panzer Force had not yet recovered from the losses of 1942. The new Panthers weren't ready, committing 2,500 tanks and assault guns, roughly 70% of all German armor on the Eastern Front, to a single operation against a position the Soviets had been fortifying for months, was not a rational use of a finite and irreplaceable resource. He reportedly said, in words reconstructed from his own memoir, that he couldn't understand why they were attacking in the East at all in 1943. He was told the attack had to happen for political reasons. He didn't accept that answer. The argument failed. Citadel went ahead. It opened on the 5th of July, 1943. On the northern face of the salient, Field Marshal Walther Model's Ninth Army made minimal progress against Soviet defensive lines that were, in some places, more than 150 kilometers deep. Not a single line, but multiple successive belts of minefields, anti-tank guns, artillery, and prepared positions. On the southern face, the 4th Panzer Army made more progress. and the engagement at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July brought the largest single day of armoured combat in the entire war. The numbers involved at Prokhorovka have been revised downward by more recent scholarship. The old figure of 1,200 tanks engaged simultaneously appears to be an overestimate. But whatever the precise count, the outcome was not the German breakthrough that had been anticipated. Then, on the 13th of July, Hitler suspended Citadel. Allied landings in Sicily on the 10th of July had created a new theatre crisis, and Hitler needed panzer divisions moved west. The operation that Guderian had spent months arguing against, that had consumed irreplaceable armoured strength, that had failed to achieve its objective against a prepared and forewarned defence, was simply called off. The Soviet counter-offensives that followed, Operation Kutuzov in the north, Operation Rumyantsev in the south, pushed German lines back further than Citadel had ever advanced. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Red Army in the summer of 1943. It never came back. Guderian's response to Kursk's failure was characteristically direct. He filed detailed assessments of what had gone wrong with the equipment. The Panther's reliability failures during the battle had been serious, with many vehicles lost to mechanical breakdown rather than enemy action, and pushed harder for the rationalization of production he'd been advocating since March. He made some headway. Albert Speer's armaments ministry and Guderian's inspectorate developed a closer working relationship during 1943 and into 44, streamlining some of the production chaos. Panther production did improve through 1944, averaging 315 vehicles per month, but the losses on the Eastern Front were running consistently faster than production could replace them. The math didn't work. Guderian knew the math didn't work. He was one of the few people in a position of authority in the German high command who engaged with the actual numbers rather than with Hitler's preferences. What I want to be clear about before we move into the events of 1944 is the moral complexity of Guderian's position during this period. He was not a passive figure. He participated in systems and structures that caused enormous harm, a subject we will address directly in a later chapter. He served an ideological state that was conducting mass atrocities, and his continued service, however motivated by professional conviction, was real participation. That he disagreed with Hitler about tanks and operational strategy doesn't exonerate him from the larger context of what that army was doing and what it represented. I mention this here because the Inspector General period is often narrated as purely a technical story, a competent professional trying to fix a broken machine. It was that. It was also more than that. Chapter 8, The Panther's Failures and the Road to Kursk. When equipment becomes a hostage, if you want to understand why Kursk failed at the level of machines rather than men, you need to spend time with the Panther's production history, which I've found to be one of the most clarifying single threads in the entire story of the German armoured force in the middle years of the war. The Panther program started, essentially, as a reaction to shock. When German Panzer crews first encountered the Soviet T-34 in the summer and autumn of 1941, the response in Berlin was a mixture of denial and alarm. The T-34 wasn't supposed to exist, or rather, German intelligence had known Soviet tanks were being developed, but had substantially underestimated their quality. The T-34's sloped armor, wide tracks for soft ground, diesel engine reducing fire risk, and powerful 76mm gun combined into a vehicle that outclassed most German armor of 1941 in multiple important ways. The German response was a design competition, won by Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, MAN, in the spring of 1942. The prototype was tested at Kummersdorf that autumn and accepted for production. The initial production target was 250 vehicles per month at Man. In January 1943, this target was increased to 600 per month. I've looked at the production data, and I want to be honest about how implausible that 600 figure was. German industrial capacity in early 1943 was not structured to produce 600 of anything complex and new per month. The machine tool requirements alone, the specialized equipment needed to machine the hull components, simply weren't available in sufficient numbers. The target was set by desire, not by engineering analysis. Guderian's frustration with the Panther program wasn't with the vehicle's fundamental design, which he believed in. It was with the decision to rush it into service. Finished Panthers were rolling off the line at the end of 1942 and suffering persistent fires in the engine compartment, the result of fuel line failures that hadn't been caught before production began. The transmission was a known weak point. The final drive units, the gearboxes transmitting power to the tracks, were chronically stressed by the vehicle's weight of roughly 45 tons. These weren't random quality control failures. They were engineering problems that required time to solve through systematic testing and modification. Time that the Wehrmacht's production timetable didn't allow for. By the time Guderian became Inspector General in March 1943, Panthers were being delivered to frontline units in significant numbers, and units were reporting equipment serviceability figures that made him furious. A Panzer battalion might nominally have a full complement of Panthers on its strength, but actually have only a fraction of them in operational condition on any given day. The rest were in various states of mechanical breakdown, awaiting parts that the logistics system frequently couldn't deliver fast enough. This was the instrument Guderian had been handed to rebuild the German armoured force with. Not terrible, not what had been promised. He urged delay on Kursk repeatedly. His argument to Hitler, in briefings during the spring of 1943, was that committing the Panthers before their reliability issues were resolved would result in a battle that wasted Germany's last concentrated armoured reserve on an operation that the Soviets had been given months to prepare for. This was correct. It was correct in almost every detail, and it was ignored. Hitler had convinced himself, with the help of optimistic assessments from others in the chain of command, that the Tigers and Panthers would be battle-winning weapons whose mere presence would crack the Soviet defensive lines. This was the same category of magical thinking that had produced the Versailles-violating promise that a 6-month war in Russia was achievable. What I find most historically revealing about the Kursk preparations is not the tactical argument. That argument has been rehearsed by every military historian who's ever written about the Eastern Front, but the systemic one. The German High Command's decision-making process in the spring of 1943 was structured in a way that made it almost impossible to act on accurate information. Hitler received the information he wanted to receive. Officers who presented unwelcome data did so at professional risk. Guderian was an exception. He had the direct channel to Hitler that he'd negotiated in March, and he used it. But even his direct access couldn't overcome the fundamental dynamic of a command structure built around a leader who equated disagreement with disloyalty. During the battle itself, Guderian was not commanding in the field. He was in his Inspector General role, monitoring equipment reports coming back from the front. The numbers were grim in ways he had predicted. Panthers in the first days of the battle suffered significant mechanical losses. Of the roughly 200 Panthers deployed on the southern face of the salient, a substantial proportion were out of action due to mechanical failure, not enemy fire. Within the first week, the Tigers performed better. The Tiger I was a more mature design by this point, and its crews were better trained. But even Tiger units reported serviceability problems in the intense conditions of summer combat. The Ferdinand tank destroyer, of which 90 were deployed on the northern face, suffered catastrophically from its own specific design flaw. It had no secondary armament, which made it vulnerable to Soviet infantry at close range. The lesson Guderian drew from Kursk was one he'd been drawing for 2 years in various forms. It wasn't a lesson about doctrine or tactics. It was a lesson about organizational culture. An army that cannot tell its leadership the truth about what its equipment can and cannot do is an army that will keep sending men and machines into situations they're not prepared for. Guderian had told the truth about the Panther. He'd been overruled. The Panther had failed in exactly the ways he'd predicted, and yet, and this is the part that always strikes me, the same organizational dynamics that had produced Kursk were still in place the morning after Kursk ended. Nothing structural had changed. The information problem had not been solved. It had simply migrated to the next crisis. Through the second half of 1943 and into early 1944, Guderian continued his work as Inspector General, arguing for rationalized production, pushing for standardized training, trying to address the spare parts shortage that was crippling frontline serviceability. He had some successes. Panzer IV production was maintained at reasonable levels. Assault gun output expanded substantially, partly because assault guns were simpler and cheaper to produce than full tanks, and partly because Guderian recognized their value in defensive combat. None of this changed the fundamental strategic arithmetic. The Eastern Front was consuming German armoured strength faster than the industrial base could replace it, and the Western Allies were preparing a second front that would split that industrial base's output even further. By early 1944, Guderian was a man who understood, with the precision of someone who read production statistics rather than propaganda summaries, that Germany was losing the war. He had told Hitler in January 1944 that a strong defensive line in the east could potentially free forces to confront the anticipated Allied invasion in the west. Hitler rejected the proposal. Guderian had been arguing for strategic rationality for roughly 3 years at this point, and had won some minor production battles while losing every major strategic argument. The summer of 1944 was approaching, and with it, a crisis that would change everything. Not a military operation, but an assassination attempt, and the extraordinary sequence of events that followed it. Chapter 9, the 20th of July. The bomb that changed Guderian's war. I've thought hard about how to write this chapter. The 20th of July, 1944, is one of those dates where the historiography is so thick, the accounts so numerous, and the interpretive arguments so charged, that it's genuinely difficult to find stable ground. What I can say with confidence, drawing on documented sources rather than contested reconstruction, is this. A bomb planted by Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded in the conference room at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's field headquarters in East Prussia, at 12:42 in the afternoon. Hitler survived. And the consequences of that survival shaped the final 10 months of the war in ways that directly determined Guderian's role in the endgame. Guderian was not part of the conspiracy. He was not in the conference room. He was not a target of the plotters, and as far as documented evidence shows, he had no prior knowledge of the specific plan. That last point is worth handling carefully. There were many officers in the German High Command who knew, in general terms, that a resistance network existed, who had been approached at various times, who had remained silent without directly participating. Where exactly Guderian sat on that spectrum is something I cannot determine with confidence from available sources, and I won't speculate. What the record shows is that on the 21st of July, the day after the plot failed, Guderian was summoned to Hitler's headquarters and appointed chief of the General Staff of the Army. the OKH, replacing General Kurt Zeitzler, who had suffered a physical breakdown. The timing has troubled historians ever since. Guderian received one of the most senior positions in the German military the day after a plot to assassinate the supreme commander. The interpretation that's most commonly offered, and which I find broadly convincing, with caveats, is that Hitler wanted a loyal professional in the most senior staff role, someone whose competence was not in question, and whose political reliability had been demonstrated through conduct and attitude over years of service. Guderian was that person. He wasn't a Nazi in the ideological sense. He didn't hold party office. His personal correspondence doesn't reflect enthusiastic ideological commitment, but he was operationally loyal to the German army's mission in a way that had never seriously wavered, even through the dismissals and frustrations of the preceding 3 years. What happened next is the part of Guderian's biography that most complicates any attempt at simple characterization. In the aftermath of the plot, Hitler moved to purge the officer corps of anyone suspected of sympathizing with the conspirators. A military court of honor was established, a body tasked with expelling suspected disloyal officers from the Wehrmacht, stripping them of military status, and handing them over to the civil court system, which in practice meant Roland Freisler's People's Court, which in practice meant death. Guderian sat on that court of honor, alongside Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The court expelled hundreds of officers. Those officers were then tried, and many of them were executed. Guderian's participation in that process is documented and not disputed. He signed off on soften this. The court of honor was an instrument of institutional horror. The officers expelled by it and subsequently killed weren't being judged by normal legal standards. They were being destroyed by a system that had decided guilt before the proceedings began, and Guderian was part of the mechanism that processed them. Some historians have argued that his participation was effectively compelled, that refusing to sit on the court would have been suicidal. And there's something to that argument in the specific political conditions of the summer of 1944. But compulsion of that kind is itself a moral category, not an absolution. Guderian sat on the court. Officers died as a result of proceedings he participated in. That is the record. At the same time, and this is where the complexity deepens rather than resolves, Guderian's conduct as Chief of the General Staff between July 1944 and March 1945 shows a man who fought consistently and repeatedly and at personal risk against the strategic decisions he believed would accelerate Germany's destruction. He argued for the evacuation of civilian populations from the path of the advancing Red Army. He argued for the shortening of front lines. He argued for the concentration of armored reserves rather than their dispersal in politically motivated counteroffensives. He lost most of these arguments. He kept making them. The record of his confrontations with Hitler during this period, some of them reconstructed from his own memoir, others documented in other sources, suggests a man who knew the war was lost and was trying to manage its conclusion in ways that minimized further catastrophe within a system that wasn't designed to allow that. The day after his appointment, on the 21st of July, Guderian addressed the senior staff of OKH. He demanded complete loyalty to the regime from every officer under his authority. He called the conspirators traitors. These words are in the record. I've sat with them for a while and I find them impossible to entirely contextualize away, even understanding the political circumstances that made any other public posture essentially unsurvivable. What I can say is that the private Guderian, the Guderian of staff briefings and operational arguments, was simultaneously making the case to Hitler that the war couldn't be won on its current trajectory. The public speech and the private argument were in tension with each other. They lived in the same man. The strategic situation Guderian inherited as chief of the general staff was desperate in ways that the summer victories of 1941 had made structurally impossible to reverse. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive launched on the 23rd of June, 1944, had effectively destroyed Army Group Center in the space of roughly 2 months. More than 20 German divisions had been encircled and destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The losses in men and equipment were comparable in scale to Stalingrad. Then, on the 6th of June 1944, the Western Allies had landed in Normandy. Germany was now fighting on 3 major fronts: East, West, and Italy, plus suppressing partisan activity across occupied Europe, with a production base that Allied bombing was steadily degrading. The Eastern Front was Guderian's primary responsibility, and what he inherited there was a German line in various stages of collapse, manned by formations that were often at a fraction of their nominal strength, equipped with vehicles that the spare parts crisis made difficult to keep operational. He immediately began pressing for what he called an elastic defense, a doctrine of trading space for time, withdrawing to defensible lines, concentrating armored reserves rather than distributing them thinly along an extended front, counterattacking Soviet penetrations with concentrated force rather than trying to hold every position simultaneously. This was sound military thinking. It was also precisely the kind of thinking that Hitler's stand-fast psychology rejected on principle. The pattern of the next 8 months was, in essence, a cycle. Guderian would propose a rational course of action. Hitler would reject it. The situation would deteriorate in exactly the way Guderian had predicted, and Guderian would propose the next rational course of action. The man had extraordinary persistence. He also had extraordinary self-awareness about the futility of his situation. He wrote later that he often felt he was arguing not to change outcomes, because he knew the outcomes were already determined, but to place his professional judgment on record. As an archivist's instinct, I find that strangely moving. A man making arguments he knows will be rejected into a file that he hopes someone will eventually read. Chapter 10. Chief of the General Staff, arguing in a burning building. The Chief of the General Staff of the German Army, the head of the OKH, was, in theory, the most senior operational planning position in the land forces. In practice, by the summer of 1944, the position meant something considerably more constrained. Hitler had been progressively centralizing all major operational decisions in himself, since at least the winter of 1941, when his stand-fast order during the Moscow crisis had given him, in his own retrospective interpretation, credit for stabilizing the front. He believed, with genuine conviction, that professional officers were too cautious, too quick to recommend withdrawal, too focused on immediate tactical problems rather than the larger political and ideological stakes. He believed that his own will could substitute for operational logic. By the time Guderian took over as Chief of the General Staff, the position's actual authority was a fraction of its nominal one. Guderian attended Hitler's operational briefings, the Lagersbesprechungen, the situation conferences that took place usually twice daily at the Führer's headquarters. These were not normal staff meetings. They were, by multiple accounts from participants who survived, exercises in sustained unreality, in which Hitler would move divisions on maps that had ceased to exist in their nominal strength, refuse to authorize withdrawals that were tactically necessary, and respond to unwelcome assessments with eruptions of anger that made honest reporting professionally dangerous. Guderian didn't simply accept this dynamic. He pushed back, he argued. There are accounts of confrontations between Guderian and Hitler during this period that were, by the standards of how anyone was supposed to behave in that room, extraordinary in their frankness. The situation on the Eastern Front through the autumn of 1944 was a long and grinding disaster. Soviet forces pushed steadily westward. Romania changed sides in August. Bulgaria changed sides in September. In October, Soviet forces entered Hungary. The German defensive line was shortening, but it was shortening because territory was being lost, not because it was being rationally contracted. Each contraction came after fighting that consumed irreplaceable German strength. Each time the contraction could have been made earlier, on better terms, if Guderian's arguments for timely withdrawals had been accepted. Each time they weren't. The fuel situation was becoming catastrophic by late 1944. Allied bombing had hit the synthetic fuel plants at Luna and other major facilities hard through the summer and autumn. German aircraft were being grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Panzer formations were receiving fractional fuel allocations that limited their operational range severely. A tank is not a weapon if it can't move. A panzer corps without fuel is a collection of large steel obstacles that can defend a fixed position, but can't execute the elastic counterattack doctrine that Guderian needed to make a defense work. He knew what was happening to the fuel supply. He raised it. The situation didn't improve. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, which became known to Allied commanders as the Battle of the Bulge, was, from Guderian's perspective, a strategic crime. Hitler had decided to launch a major armoured offensive in the West, committing the last concentrated German armoured reserve, including panzer divisions that Guderian wanted desperately to have available for the inevitable Soviet winter offensive, to an operation he considered strategically delusional. The objective was to drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, capture Antwerp, and cut off the Allied armies in the north. To achieve this, it would have needed surprise, favourable weather, intact fuel supplies that the Germans could capture, and Soviet forbearance about launching their own offensive while Germany's reserves were committed westward. None of those conditions were reliably in place. Guderian argued against the Ardennes offensive, as he had argued against Citadel, as he had argued against every major strategic decision he'd been in a position to contest since taking over as Chief of the General Staff. He wanted those panzer reserves held for the Eastern Front, where Soviet intelligence indicated a massive winter offensive was being prepared. He was told his intelligence was wrong, that his figures were exaggerated, that the Soviet armies were exhausted and incapable of another major push. He knew the figures weren't wrong. His intelligence section had assembled data on Soviet force concentrations opposite Army Group A and Army Group Center that were detailed and alarming. Hitler reportedly called the assessments idiotic and told him the officer who had prepared them belonged in a mental institution. The Ardennes offensive opened on the 16th of December, 1944. In the first days, it made striking progress. The surprise was genuine. The Allied response was initially disorganized, and the weather grounded Allied air power for several days. But the operation ran out of momentum within 2 weeks. The fuel the German columns needed to sustain the drive wasn't captured from Allied dumps in sufficient quantities. Allied resistance stiffened, the weather cleared, and Allied air power returned with devastating effect. By early January 1945, the German forces in the Ardennes were being pushed back. The armoured strength that Guderian had wanted to hold for the East had been spent in the West. It hadn't achieved its objective. The Soviet winter offensive, Operation Vistula Oder, began on the 12th of January, 1945, 4 weeks earlier than the German High Command had anticipated. It was, by any standard, one of the most powerful offensive operations in the history of warfare. Soviet forces committed more than 2 million soldiers, roughly 6,000 tanks, and over 32,000 artillery pieces. They attacked across a front of more than 400 kilometers. Within days, German defensive lines that Guderian had been warning were dangerously thin were torn apart. Soviet armored spearheads advanced at speeds that recalled, sickeningly, the German advances of 1941, 60 kilometers in a single day in some sectors. German Army Group A effectively ceased to exist as a coherent formation within 2 weeks. Guderian's response was methodical and, given the circumstances, almost admirable in its focus. He worked to identify where reserves could be scraped together, which units could be moved from less threatened sectors, what defensive lines might be held long enough to slow the Soviet advance toward Berlin. He kept arguing for evacuations of the Courland pocket in Latvia, which had roughly 30 German divisions sitting in an enclave that served no strategic purpose, but which Hitler refused to evacuate because abandoning it felt like retreat. Those divisions in Courland could have been moved by sea to defend Pomerania or East Prussia. They stayed in Courland. They were still there when the war ended. Guderian had been arguing for their evacuation since the previous autumn. The last months of his tenure as Chief of the General Staff were a compressed study in the particular exhaustion of being right in an organization that can't hear you. He was arguing facts. Hitler was arguing will. The facts kept being confirmed by events. The will kept failing to materialize them. And Guderian, who had been through this cycle in one form or another since the winter before Moscow, kept showing up to the briefings, kept presenting his data, kept making the case. He was 66 years old. He hadn't slept properly in months. His health was deteriorating. The building he was arguing in was, literally and figuratively, about to catch fire. Chapter 11, The Final Dismissal. March 1945, and the end of everything, the 28th of March, 1945. Heinz Guderian was dismissed as Chief of the General Staff of the German Army for the second time in his career. The first dismissal, on Christmas Day 1941, had come after a tactical disagreement about a withdrawal before Moscow. This one came after a confrontation about a counteroffensive at Kustrin, a fortress town on the Oder River, roughly 70 kilometers east of Berlin, that Guderian believed was tactically incoherent and that Hitler insisted on. The specifics of the Kustrin argument are less important than what the dismissal itself represented. The complete exhaustion of whatever working relationship had existed between Guderian and Hitler since the previous July. I want to describe the context of that dismissal carefully, because it sits at the intersection of several things at once. By late March 1945, Soviet forces had already crossed the Oder in several places and were consolidating positions for the final drive on Berlin. American and British forces were across the Rhine and moving rapidly eastward. Germany's Western Front was collapsing in real time. The fuel situation had become so critical that major armored formations were effectively immobile. The Luftwaffe was flying minimal sorties. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Inside Hitler's headquarters, which by this point had moved to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the briefings had taken on a quality of unreality that multiple witnesses later described as genuinely disturbing. Hitler was still moving formations on maps. Some of those formations existed only on paper. Guderian had been having arguments of escalating intensity with Hitler through February and March. He pushed again for the evacuation of the Courland pocket. He pushed for the withdrawal of Army Group South from Hungary, where Hitler had insisted on positioning armoured reserves for an operation to retake Budapest that had no strategic logic except Hitler's personal fixation on the region's oil fields, to more defensible positions. He pushed for a diplomatic approach to the Western Allies, arguing that Germany should try to arrange a ceasefire in the West to concentrate everything against the Soviet advance in the East. Each of these proposals was rejected. The confrontations were reportedly volcanic in their intensity, shouting matches, not staff discussions. The specific trigger for the final dismissal was Guderian's advocacy for General Theodor Buss, commander of the Ninth Army, who had tried and failed to relieve Kustrin. Hitler blamed Busse for the failure. Guderian defended Buss's handling of the operation, arguing that the failure was the result of impossible conditions rather than command incompetence. The argument escalated. Hitler dismissed Guderian. It was, in one sense, the same argument Guderian had been having with Hitler since December 1941. The argument between a professional military assessment and a political will that refused to accommodate military reality. The form changed. The content didn't. The terms of the dismissal were, in the characteristic style of the Third Reich, simultaneously punitive and absurd. Guderian was sent on leave, officially for health reasons. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't court-martialed. He was handed a document and told to go rest. In the middle of a war that was entering its final catastrophic weeks, the German state's most senior army staff officer was sent home on sick leave. He went to a sanatorium in Bavaria. Berlin fell to Soviet forces on the 2nd of May. Hitler died in his bunker on the 30th of April. And Guderian, the man who had helped build the army that had won France and nearly won Russia, was sitting in a Bavarian health resort waiting for the Americans to arrive. The American arrival came on the 10th of May, 1945. US forces captured Guderian without incident. He was taken into custody, processed as a prisoner of war, and held for questioning. What followed was a long period of detention. Guderian was held in American captivity until June of 1948, more than 3 years after the war ended, while Allied investigators and later Nuremberg-connected proceedings examined his conduct and the question of whether he was culpable for war crimes. The Soviet Union and Poland both sought his trial. The American authorities, after extensive review, declined to prosecute him. The decision not to prosecute Guderian has generated a substantial historiographical debate that was already underway by the time he died in 1954 and has never been fully resolved. The argument for prosecution rested on several documented facts. His troops' implementation of the Commissar order in the early weeks of Barbarossa, the order to execute captured Soviet political officers, was something that occurred within his command structure. His participation in the Court of Honor after the July plot was documented. His service to the Nazi state through its final catastrophic phase was real. The argument against prosecution, the one that prevailed, essentially held that Guderian was a professional soldier operating within a chain of command, that he had no direct personal involvement in atrocity, and that his disagreements with Hitler over strategy constituted some form of evidence of moral independence. Whether that argument was legally sound or morally convincing is a question that serious historians still argue about. What Guderian did with his freedom after his release in June 1948 was right. Panzerlieder, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten in German, was published in 1951 and translated into English shortly after. It became one of the most widely read military memoirs of the entire war, and it shaped the way a generation of readers, military professionals, and historians understood the German army's performance in the Second World War. It was also, in important ways, a carefully constructed document of self-justification. Guderian's memoir presents him as a professional soldier surrounded by incompetents, ideologues, and a supreme commander who refused to listen. The professional soldier parts are substantially accurate. The framing that places him at a clean moral distance from what his army actually did is considerably less so. I've read Panzerlieder multiple times at this point, both in German excerpts and in the English translation, And what I find most interesting about it isn't the operational narrative, which is detailed and largely reliable on points that can be cross-checked. What interests me is the consistent absence of certain things. The Commissar order is not discussed. The Court of Honor is given minimal attention. The larger context of what the German army was doing in the Soviet Union, not just the operational war, but the systematic mass murder that was occurring in the same operational zone, sometimes in coordination with the same supply lines that fed his panzer groups, is not addressed. This absence isn't random. It's structural. Guderian was writing to be read in a West Germany that was rebuilding its military identity, and the memoir served that purpose. The post-war Guderian is a figure I find harder to engage with than the wartime one, precisely because the gap between what he knew and what he wrote is so visible once you've spent time with the broader historical record. He knew what the Einsatzgruppen were doing in the operational areas behind his panzer groups. The documentation is clear on that. He didn't stop it, and he didn't record it in his memoir. He sat on a court that sent men to their deaths and wrote about it in a single paragraph. He participated in the construction of a post-war narrative that the German military establishment found useful, and he did it with the same energy and intelligence he'd brought to everything else he'd ever done. What I'm left with, after spending months with his story, is not a simple verdict. Guderian was genuinely brilliant at the specific thing he did, understanding armored warfare, building the doctrine and the force to execute it, fighting institutional resistance with arguments backed by data. He was also a man whose brilliance operated within a moral frame that he chose not to examine critically. That combination, professional excellence and ethical compartmentalization, is not unique to Guderian in the history of the Second World War, or in the history of military institutions more broadly. But it's particularly visible in him, because his career was so well documented, and his post-war memoir so carefully constructed to minimize its visibility. The man who taught generals to drive fast through the enemy's weakest point was, in the end, also very good at driving his own history through the gaps where scrutiny was weakest. Chapter 12. Captivity, Silence, and the Architecture of Forgetting. There is something disorienting about the gap between the scale of what the war had been and the quietness of how it ended for Guderian personally. He was captured by American forces in Bavaria in early May 1945, a few days after Germany's formal military collapse. He wasn't hiding. He didn't flee west in disguise, as some senior officers attempted. He was simply there, in a Bavarian health resort where he'd been sent on enforced sick leave by the state whose army he'd led until 6 weeks before the end. The Americans found him, processed him, and placed him in custody. That was it. 3 years of the most intense operational strain any senior officer in the Second World War had experienced. The Eastern Front, the Inspector Generalship, the Chief of the General Staff roll through the catastrophic final year, and it ended with paperwork and a camp bed in Bavaria. The 3 years of American captivity that followed, roughly June 1942 through June 1948, were not, by the standards of what German prisoners of war experienced in Soviet captivity, harsh. Guderian was held in the Western Allied prison camp system, was treated in accordance with Geneva Convention standards, had access to writing materials, and was subjected to extensive interrogation by American and British military intelligence officers who were, in the immediate post-war period, extremely interested in what senior German commanders knew about Soviet military capacity. This is a dimension of post-war history that doesn't get enough attention in general accounts. The United States Army, almost immediately after VE Day, was studying the Soviet military through the lens of German combat experience, and the German generals who had fought on the Eastern Front had information that American intelligence found genuinely valuable. Guderian participated in these debriefings. He spoke at length about Soviet operational methods, about the Red Army's evolution from the shock of Barbarossa in 1941 through the systematic improvement it had demonstrated by the offensives of 1944. He talked about Soviet logistics, about tank tactics, about the qualities of the T-34 and the later T-44. The Americans were, at this point, preparing for the possibility of military confrontation with the Soviet Union in Europe, and the institutional knowledge that Guderian represented was not something they were inclined to waste by subjecting him to a protracted war crimes trial. That calculus, operational intelligence value, weighed against accountability, shaped how the American authorities handled him. And I think it's important to be honest about that rather than presenting his non-prosecution as a verdict on the moral question. The Soviet Union and Poland both formally requested Guderian's extradition for war crimes prosecution. The American authorities declined. Their reasoning, documented in the records of the proceedings, was that there was insufficient evidence to establish personal criminal command responsibility for the specific acts under consideration. What those specific acts were is worth spelling out clearly, because they've been somewhat obscured in popular accounts of Guderian's post-war treatment. The Cambridge University Press scholarly study, Hitler's Panzer Generals, published in 2023, and drawing on German archival sources, including divisional, corps, and Panzer Group files, found direct evidence pointing to widespread implementation of the Commissar order within units under Guderian's command during the early months of Barbarossa. The Commissar order, issued on the 6th of June 1941, directed German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers immediately, rather than treating them as prisoners of war. It was a clear violation of the laws of war. It was carried out in Guderian's operational zone. What the American investigators couldn't establish to their procedural standard was a direct chain of evidence linking Guderian personally to the issuance or implementation of specific criminal orders. This distinction between command responsibility in the broader sense and direct personal culpability in the narrower legal sense was one that ran through many of the post-war proceedings and produced outcomes that later historians, working with more complete archives, have found inadequate. The institutional record, as historians have now assembled it from multiple archival sources, paints a considerably more damning picture than the legal proceedings captured. But 1948 was not 2023, and the archives available in 1948 were not the archives available now. What Guderian did with his time during captivity, when he wasn't being debriefed on Soviet military matters, was right. He wrote his memoir in rough form while still in custody, revising and shaping the manuscript through the months of detention. By the time he was released in the summer of 1948, the essential structure of what would become Panzer leader was already in place. He had spent 3 years in captivity composing, at manuscript length, a version of his career that centered his own professional judgment, his conflicts with Hitler, his advocacy for rational strategy against irrational political interference. It was not an unintelligent document. Large sections of it hold up against the archival record with reasonable accuracy on the operational details. The problems weren't in what he got wrong about tanks and battles. The problems were in what he didn't write at all. He was released into a West Germany that was itself engaged in a particular kind of national project. The Federal Republic in the late 1940s and early 1950s was being rebuilt politically, economically, and militarily as a partner of the Western Alliance. The construction of the Bundeswehr, the new West German army, required, among other things, a workable historical narrative about the Wehrmacht, one that distinguished between a professional army that had fought with skill and honor and the ideological agencies, the SS, the SD, the Einsatzgruppen, that had committed the worst atrocities. This clean Wehrmacht narrative, as historians have called it, was not primarily invented by any single person. It emerged from a convergence of institutional needs. American Cold War requirements, West German political necessity, and the self-interested memoir writing of the surviving officer class. Guderian's Panzer leader was one of the most visible texts associated with this narrative's construction and propagation. The book was published in German in 1951 and in English translation in 1952. Its reception was extraordinary. It was read by officers in the United States Army, the British Army, and across NATO's developing military establishment. It was reviewed enthusiastically in military professional journals. It became a standard reference text in military education. For a generation of Western officers who were trying to understand how to fight a potential Soviet conventional offensive in Europe, Panzer Leader was a primary source written by the man who had actually done it. The operational content was genuinely useful. The moral framing, the implicit separation of professional military conduct from the ideological context in which that conduct occurred, was absorbed along with the operational lessons, quietly, without most readers examining it critically. Guderian's health had deteriorated significantly during his years of captivity and continued to trouble him after his release. He was 60 years old in 1948, had experienced the sustained physical and psychological stress of the war's final year, and was managing heart disease. He settled in the Bavarian town of Schwangau bei Füssen in the foothills of the Alps, a place of considerable natural beauty that was, in its way, about as far removed from the Eastern Front as geography allowed. He did some writing, gave some lectures, contributed to the developing literature on the German army's wartime experiences. He watched the Bundeswehr take shape. He watched former colleagues take positions in the new force. He was consulted, occasionally, on doctrinal questions. He was not a central figure in the new West German military establishment, but he wasn't invisible in it either. He died on the 14th of May, 1954, at Schwangau bei Füssen. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was heart disease. He was buried at Goslar, where his wife Marguerite would eventually be buried beside him after her own death in 1972. The obituaries were broadly respectful, the language of military excellence, the acknowledgement of his contribution to armoured warfare doctrine, the careful distance from any sustained moral reckoning. He'd had less than 6 years of post-captivity freedom. He'd spent most of those years writing and managing declining health. It wasn't, by any measure, a long post-war life, and the story he'd told in Panzer Leader was already travelling the world under its own momentum, carrying his version of events into military academies and history shelves and strategic planning offices across the Western Alliance. Chapter 13. The Commissar Order. The crime that didn't make the memoir. I want to spend this entire chapter on a single subject. What Guderian knew about the criminal orders that governed the conduct of his forces in the Soviet Union, what those orders produced, and what he chose to do with that knowledge when he sat down to write his memoir. This is not a comfortable chapter to write. It wasn't a comfortable chapter to research, but it's the chapter this documentary requires, because you can't write seriously about Guderian's career without engaging honestly with the part of it that his own account worked hardest to make invisible. The Commissar Order was issued on the 6th of June, 1941, 16 days before Barbarossa began. It directed German military commanders to have captured Soviet political commissars, the Communist Party officials embedded in Red Army units. separated from other prisoners immediately upon capture and shot. It was not a marginal or ambiguous directive. It was issued through the normal Wehrmacht command chain in writing to army group commanders who transmitted it to their subordinate commanders. Guderian received it. His 2nd Panzer Group command structure received it. The question of what he did with it and what his subordinate formations did with it is now addressable through archival research that wasn't available to the investigators who reviewed his case in 1948. The Cambridge academic study published in 2023, drawing on divisional and corps-level files from the German military archives, found that units under Guderian's command were among the most active in implementing the Commissar order in the opening months of Barbarossa. The same study found that there is not a single letter in the extensive private correspondence of Guderian and the other panzer generals it examined that expresses any objection to, criticism of, or even acknowledgement of the mass killing programs occurring within their zones of command. Not one. The letters discuss operational matters, personal news, logistics. They don't mention what was happening to prisoners and to the Jewish populations of the towns and cities through which the panzer columns passed. That absence, the study argues, is itself telling. These were not men who didn't know. These were men who knew and who chose, in their private correspondence as in their public memoirs, not to record it. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units of the SS and security police, operated in the rear areas of the advancing German armies in the Soviet Union. Their operations depended, practically, on the logistical infrastructure of the Wehrmacht: roads, fuel allocations, communications networks, local population information gathered by military intelligence. The army and the Einsatzgruppen were not separate systems operating in the same geographic space by coincidence. They were operationally intertwined in ways that the clean Wehrmacht narrative required erasing. Guderian's Panzer Group was advancing through territory where the Einsatzgruppen were conducting mass shootings in the weeks and months after his columns moved through. The command structures were parallel, not identical, a distinction that the post-war narrative made into an absolute moral separation that the historical record doesn't support. What could Guderian actually have done? This is the question that defenders of his conduct most frequently raise, and it deserves a serious, rather than a dismissive answer. He was operating in a command structure that was, from the top, ideologically committed to a war of annihilation in the East. Officers who refused criminal orders risked their careers and, potentially, more. There were Wehrmacht officers who pushed back against specific criminal directives, who attempted to limit the scope of their implementation within their own commands. And the record shows that some of these officers faced professional consequences rather than physical ones. The risk was real, but it was professional, not existential, for a senior general officer. That's not nothing. It also isn't enough to transform compliance into helplessness. What Guderian chose to do, and I use the word chose deliberately, was implement the directives he received as a professional officer, advance his formations according to his operational doctrine, win battles by the standards his chain of command valued, and file no documented objection to the criminal orders that governed the treatment of prisoners and civilian populations in his operational zone. Then, after the war, he wrote a memoir that talked about tanks and strategy and his arguments with Hitler, and did not discuss any of this. He did not discuss the Commissar order. He did not discuss the Einsatzgruppen. He did not discuss the fate of the Jewish populations in the territories his formations passed through. The memoir is over 500 pages long. There was space. He chose how to fill it. I find this particularly striking when I put it beside the professional Guderian, the man who wrote in Achtung, Panzer, with such precision about technical constraints and ethical obligations of command, who argued strenuously against operations he considered professionally irresponsible, who kept filing objections to Hitler even when he knew they'd be ignored, on the grounds that placing his professional judgment on record mattered. That man had a developed sense of institutional integrity. He believed records mattered. He believed that honesty about military realities was a professional obligation. That same man wrote a memoir that systematically omitted the most important moral realities of the war he'd participated in. The contrast isn't random, it's the result of a decision. The historiographical debate about how to weigh Guderian's operational contributions against his moral failures has evolved significantly since his death. In the 1950s and 60s, when Panzer leader was being read most widely, and when the Cold War's doctrinal demands made German operational expertise politically useful, the dominant framework was essentially the one Guderian had constructed in his memoir: a talented professional soldier, flawed institution, regime he served with diminishing enthusiasm. By the 1980s and 90s, and especially after the Crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition in Germany in the 1990s, which used archival evidence to document Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities, that framework came under sustained scholarly pressure. By the 21st century, academic historians, working with the now more fully accessible German military archives, have produced a picture considerably at odds with the memoir's self-presentation. None of this erases Guderian's contribution to armored warfare doctrine, and I want to be precise about that. The intellectual work of the interwar period, the development of the Panzer doctrine, the construction of the armored division as a combined arms system, the insistence on radio communications as the enabling technology, the writing of Achtung, Panzer, stands on its own analytical merits. You can engage with that work seriously without endorsing or minimizing the moral context in which it was eventually applied. Military history that reduces every question to a moral verdict is not good history, but military history that separates the operational from the moral, treating them as unconnected domains, is also not good history. Guderian's career is precisely the kind of case that requires holding both dimensions simultaneously, without letting either one collapse into the other. What troubles me most, sitting with all of this, is not the wartime conduct itself, which was the product of institutional pressures and command structures that shaped everyone operating within them, but the post-war choice. The memoir was written in freedom, not under compulsion. Guderian had survived when millions hadn't. He had access to his own memory, his own records, his own knowledge of what had occurred in the operational zones of his command. He chose to write 500 pages about the war and to leave the most important things out. That choice had consequences. The book shaped how people understood the German army's conduct for decades. It contributed materially to a historical narrative that obscured accountability for mass atrocity, and it did so with the same systematic intelligence that Guderian had brought to everything else he'd ever organized. The General's Last Operation, executed with precision. Chapter 14, The Afterlife of an Idea, Guderian's Doctrine in the Cold War, and Beyond Guderian, died in May of 1954. But in a meaningful sense, his ideas didn't. They traveled. They crossed the Atlantic in the pages of Panzer Leader, and in the detailed after-action reports and historical studies that former German officers had produced during the American captivity period, under the supervision of the US Army Historical Division. Those documents, hundreds of them, covering every major Eastern Front campaign in operational detail, were deposited in American military archives and became standard reading for a generation of American officers trying to understand how to fight Soviet armored formations in Central Europe. Guderian's doctrine, stripped of its specific German context and translated into Cold War NATO planning, became a foundational text of Western conventional defense. The American Army's Field Manual 100-5, the document that codified the airland battle doctrine in 1982, drew, at an intellectual level, on many of the same principles that Guderian had articulated in the 1930s: depth, speed, combined arms integration, attacking the enemy's command and logistics structure, rather than simply engaging their frontline forces. The specific language was American. The organizational architecture was NATO, but the underlying operational logic: fight in depth, disrupt the enemy's decision cycle, concentrate combat power at the decisive point, and exploit before the opponent can respond, was recognizable as a descendant of what Guderian had argued for since the 1920s. The intellectual lineage was explicitly acknowledged by some American doctrine writers of the period. This influence wasn't linear or unmediated. American officers didn't simply read Panzer Leader and copy it. They filtered German operational experience through their own doctrinal debates, through the lessons of Korea and Vietnam, through the specific technical and geographical constraints of a potential Soviet conventional assault, through the Fulda Gap in West Germany. What emerged from that synthesis, particularly in the work of General Don Starry at the Army's Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth in the late 1970s, was a distinctly American doctrine that happened to be intellectually compatible with Guderian's core principles. Whether that constitutes influence or parallel evolution at the conceptual level is a question military historians argue about. And I don't want to overstate the directness of the line. What is less ambiguous is the influence of the German officer memoirs, including Panzer Leader, on the general professional culture of the Western military establishment through the 1950s and 60s. These books were read at staff colleges. They were discussed in professional journals. They shaped the vocabulary with which Western officers talked about operational art, about the relationship between speed and decision-making, about the difference between tactical and operational levels of war. The German operational experience in the East was treated, in these circles, as a body of professional knowledge that could be extracted from its ideological context and applied to new problems. That extraction was, as we've established, morally complicated by everything the memoir omitted. But the professional influence was real. The Israeli Defense Forces developed a doctrine of armored warfare in the 1950s and 60s that drew heavily on German Panzer doctrine, mediated partly through their own combat experience in the 1948 and 1956 wars. Officers of the IDF studied the German armored campaigns with the particular intensity of people who expected to fight against armored opponents with limited strategic depth and limited manpower. The operational logic of concentration, speed, and exploitation, of hitting where the opponent is weakest and moving faster than their command can respond, resonated with the specific geography and political constraints of the State of Israel. There is a particular historical irony in German Panzer doctrine, developed and applied in campaigns that were conducted in the same ideological space as the Holocaust, being studied and adapted by the Army of the Jewish State. History is full of these ironies. They don't simplify anything. They just make everything more difficult and more necessary to understand. The Gulf War of 1991 provided what many Western observers called a large-scale validation of the airland battle doctrine that had been developing since the early 1980s. Coalition armored forces, fighting in the deserts of Kuwait and southern Iraq, executed deep maneuver operations against Iraqi defensive formations with a speed and coordination that owed something. Through multiple layers of intellectual transmission, to the operational principles Guderian had spent his career developing: the 100-hour ground war, the left hook, the encirclement of Iraqi forces in Kuwait. These operations were conceptually related, however distantly, to the same doctrinal tradition, and they worked under the specific conditions of that campaign with a decisiveness that reinforced the intellectual prestige of the operational school Guderian had helped found. There is a danger in this kind of retrospective success tracing that I want to name explicitly. Doctrine that works in one set of conditions against a specific enemy in specific terrain with specific technological advantages doesn't necessarily work in all conditions. The German Panzer doctrine worked brilliantly in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940 because those were specific enemies in specific conditions. It ran into serious trouble in the Soviet Union because the conditions were categorically different. The distances were different. The terrain was different. The enemy's capacity for strategic depth was different. And the logistical demands exceeded what the doctrine had been built to sustain. The lesson of Guderian's career isn't simply that his doctrine was correct. The lesson is that his doctrine was correct within specific parameters, and that exceeding those parameters without honest analysis of the constraints produces catastrophe. The contemporary relevance of this lesson isn't abstract. Modern armored doctrine in multiple armies continues to be shaped by the intellectual tradition that Guderian helped establish. The principles of combined arms, of speed and depth, of disrupting an opponent's decision cycle. These appear in American, British, Israeli, and Russian operational doctrine in various forms. What also continues to be relevant, and what is perhaps more important, is the organizational lesson that Guderian's career demonstrated at such cost. The catastrophic danger of a command structure that cannot process honest information about the gap between what a force can actually do and what political will demands that it do. That gap between operational reality and political expectation destroyed the German army in Russia. It has destroyed other armies in other places since. It will likely destroy armies in the future. Guderian's career is one of the most detailed case studies we have of how that destruction unfolds, from the inside, in real time. The question of how to teach Guderian's operational legacy without inadvertently rehabilitating his institutional complicity is one that military educators have not fully resolved. You can teach the doctrine without endorsing the man. You can study the operational art of the Ardennes breakthrough without requiring that the student accept the clean Wehrmacht myth. But doing that requires explicitly naming the myth, explicitly addressing the moral context, and treating the operational brilliance and the moral failure as equally real aspects of the same historical record. That's harder than just reading Panzer Leader as a professional field manual. It's also more honest, and honesty about historical complexity is, in my view, the minimum that serious military education owes to the people it trains to use force. Chapter 15. Reckoning. What Guderian's career actually means. I've been building toward this chapter since the opening of this documentary, and I want to be honest with you about something before I begin it. There isn't a clean ending. There isn't a verdict that resolves the tension between the genuine intellectual brilliance and the genuine moral failure, between the professional integrity of the strategic arguments and the professional complicity in the institutional crimes, between the Guderian, who kept telling Hitler operational truths no one else would say, and the Guderian who wrote 500 pages and left the most important truths out. Real historical figures don't resolve into clean verdicts. That's exactly what makes them worth studying. What I am confident about after spending this long with his story is a set of things that I believe the archival and scholarly record supports clearly. First, Guderian was, by the standards of his era and profession, an exceptional operational thinker. The development of the Panzer doctrine, the integration of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air support into a combined arms system capable of moving faster than an opponent's command structure could respond, was a genuine intellectual achievement. It was grounded in serious theoretical work, validated through systematic exercises, and refined through combat experience. Whatever else is true of Guderian, that contribution to the intellectual history of warfare is real. Second, the doctrine he developed and applied was used in the service of wars of aggression and in the East, in the service of a war that had genocide embedded in its operational framework from the beginning. The speed of Guderian's panzer groups in the summer of 1941 wasn't simply a military achievement. It was also the mechanism by which millions of Soviet civilians came under German occupation in weeks rather than months. Occupation that the German state had planned in explicit detail to accompany with mass murder. The pace of advance and the pace of atrocity were connected. The tanks didn't commit the killings. The tanks made the scope of the killings possible. Third, Guderian knew what was happening in the zones his formations moved through, and he chose neither to resist it nor to record it honestly. This is the hardest judgment to sit with, because it sits right next to the evidence of his professional courage, his willingness to argue with Hitler, to maintain his position under pressure, to keep filing objections he knew would be rejected. The same man who showed that kind of professional integrity against institutional pressure chose, in the domain of moral accountability, a different path. He compartmentalized, and the compartmentalization was so complete and so durable that it survived into the memoir he published 6 years after the war ended, a document that shaped public understanding for decades. Fourth, the post-war narrative that Guderian helped construct. The professional soldier surrounded by ideological incompetence, the clean military institution contaminated by a criminal political regime, was not only inaccurate in important ways, but was actively harmful. It delayed serious reckoning in West Germany with the Wehrmacht's actual conduct. It provided intellectual cover for a generation of former officers to rebuild their careers and their reputations without engaging honestly with what their institutions had done. It gave Western military establishments a version of German operational history that they could use professionally while setting aside the moral context that made that history what it was. The harm wasn't incidental to the memoir's construction. It was, in some sense, its purpose. I want to be careful, though, about one thing. The judgment that Guderian was morally compromised is not the same as saying his career offers no lessons worth engaging with. It offers profound lessons, some of them instructive in the positive sense, and some of them instructive in the cautionary sense. The positive lessons are in the operational domain, the importance of combined arms integration, the centrality of communications to command, the strategic significance of logistics, the danger of doctrine divorced from honest assessment of what a force can actually sustain. These lessons have been absorbed by military organizations that, in their own contexts, use force in more constrained and accountable ways than the Wehrmacht did. The fact that the lessons have a contaminated source doesn't make them false. The cautionary lessons are, in some ways, more important and less widely absorbed. The German military's failure in the Second World War was not primarily a failure of operational art. Guderian was right about tanks. He was right about combined arms. He was right about speed and decision cycles. The failure was organizational and moral. The failure of an institution to maintain honest internal communication. The failure of senior officers to constrain political interference in operational planning. The failure of a professional culture to hold its own ethical standards against ideological pressure. These failures didn't happen suddenly in 1945. They accumulated over years, Through a series of small accommodations and silences, and institutional decisions to prioritize functional loyalty over moral integrity. And Guderian participated in that accumulation at every stage of his career. The question I keep coming back to, and I don't have a satisfying answer for it, is whether a different institutional culture would have produced a different Guderian. He was, by multiple accounts, a man of genuine intelligence and genuine conviction. The convictions that drove his operational work, the belief that armored warfare done correctly could reduce casualty compared to the attritional slaughter of 1914 to 18, the insistence that honest assessment of technical limitations was a professional obligation, were not ignoble convictions. They were, in the specific context of the German army of the 1930s and 40s, applied in service of ends that made them irrelevant to the people who suffered. The intelligence and the conviction didn't translate into moral courage, because the institutional and political context punished moral courage severely and rewarded operational brilliance lavishly. That's not an excuse. It is an explanation. The distinction matters. The Bundeswehr, the modern German armed forces founded in 1955, 1 year after Guderian's death, developed a concept of military ethics called innere Führung, usually translated as inner leadership, or leadership development and civic education. Its core principle is that the German soldier must be a citizen in uniform, a person who retains individual moral agency and individual ethical responsibility, even within a chain of command, who cannot discharge moral accountability simply by pointing to orders from above. It was built explicitly and self-consciously as a response to the failures of the Wehrmacht, as an institutional attempt to prevent the kind of moral compartmentalization that had allowed professional soldiers to execute their operational duties with skill and dedication while the institution they served committed mass atrocity. Guderian's career, and the careers of officers like him, is part of what innere Führung was designed to prevent. There is something clarifying in that institutional response, not reassuring. Nothing about this history is genuinely reassuring, but clarifying. The German military establishment, in the decades after the war, didn't only produce the clean Wehrmacht narrative, it also, eventually and imperfectly, produced a serious attempt at institutional moral reckoning. The innere Führung concept isn't perfect. No institutional ethical framework is, but it represents an acknowledgement that the compartmentalization Guderian exemplified, the separation of professional excellence from moral accountability, is not a sustainable foundation for a military institution in a democratic society. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was born in the garrison town of Kulm in 1888, the son of a Prussian officer. He died in the Bavarian foothills in 1954, a man who had helped revolutionize modern warfare, fought with genuine professional courage in an institution that served a criminal regime, and spent his last years constructing a narrative that minimized his complicity and maximized his heroism. The tanks he built doctrine around changed how armies fight. The silence he maintained about what those armies did changed how a generation understood the war they'd just survived. Both things are true. They are both his legacy. And the honest engagement with that double legacy, the brilliance and the silence, held together without collapsing one into the other, is what serious history owes to the people who lived through what he helped to unleash, and what he chose not to write about. That's where I have to leave this. Not with a verdict, but with a file. Annotated, dog-eared, still not fully resolved. That's usually where the most important histories end up.